Hello, everybody. So Mark's asked me here today to talk to you about the sort of human consequences of when we get workforce decisions wrong. And as he said, my background really lies within mid-staffs and the very real human failures there. And then, as Mark said as well, what I've gone on to do since then, and hopefully help try and drive some cultural change throughout the NHS in terms of ensuring that staff can speak up when things are not right, because we know they're not always right. So again, if some of you may have heard me speak before, so apologies for that, but I will talk a little bit about my own personal experience in mid-staffs, because it just, I think, helps put it into context. And I think also all of us now know the ramifications of mid-staffs and the Francis report, but not necessarily everybody knows that real human impact, and not just on the patients, but crucially on the staff before we even got to patients. And that's my kind of take-home message today, really. It's about looking after the staff, because if we don't look after the staff, they can't look after the patients. And I think when I started the work I do now, I kind of knew that, but I was still very much, nurse hat on, very much patient-focused and patient outcome delivery kind of focused, and it's very much become a real impact on me, just how badly in some instances we care for our staff in the NHS, and the impact of that on patients. So that really is the key message. So my experience is as a relatively junior nurse. I was a newly qualified nurse when I first started working at mid-staff, so I'd trained elsewhere, which was great because it afforded me a bit of experience and insight into how things were done elsewhere. But because I lived in Stafford and it was convenient, and I was sick of doing sort of back-to-back shifts and travelling and so on, and a development rotation came up, which was fantastic. So I knew I wanted to do sort of emergency care, intensive care kind of work, but I didn't know exactly where, so that's the rotation I went on. And I had a really good experience. It was a sort of 6-month rotation, and the first 2 wards and units I worked on, so I worked on a general medical, respiratory cardiac ward, but quite acute, and then went into the acute cardiac unit, which was fantastic. Really great care, excellent, dedicated staff, really well run and well organised. Then I went to work on a medical assessment unit through ITU as well, and had relatively good experiences through that. But it was only really when I ended up in A&E that I sort of immediately started to think things aren't quite right here. But again, as a junior person, it's very difficult for you to sort of immediately come in and start saying, well, this isn't right and that doesn't look right. But at the same time, those kind of fresh eyes of coming in afford you that insight really into thinking, hang on, this doesn't look right. So you're in a really difficult position. But it soon became clear that others felt the same. I wasn't on my own. Other staff who'd been there for quite a long time, some of them felt that things were not right. So I started doing what we were always told to do, so incident report, speak to your line manager, and this had no impact. We weren't given no feedback to the incident reports at all. I was later told, particularly back then, they were just the handwritten copies. I was later reliably informed that they ended up in the waste paper basket of the line manager. And we didn't get any feedback from line managers or the senior managers. So it became sort of, you began to sort of lose hope and become quite apathetic, really. But this also coincided with sort of a perfect storm of events. So we had a line manager who had been there for a long time, and to some extent, some of the failures had occurred and begun on her watch, but she did offer some leadership. So she retired and wasn't replaced for quite a long time, best part of a year, and so we were left without any formal nursing leadership or any ward manager. And 2 nursing sisters who had been in the department for also a very long time sort of unofficially rose to the fore and started unofficially leading the department. At the same time, the medical director of A&E, medical lead, died very suddenly and very tragically, and he wasn't replaced either. So we now had no leadership, be it nursing or medical. We were massively short of staff, both nursing and medical. Short of equipment, basics like pillows, blankets, really simple things, but mean a huge amount to patients who are in pain and in discomfort. And we were then told that we were not allowed to have bank staff. We had to use our existing staff to come back in and do extra shifts, so everybody was already working over and exhausted and coming back in. We were relying heavily on locum medical staff, which again isn't reliable, and you don't sort of get the rapport you need. And we were told as well that we were not allowed to have any training and development. That was all cut. So all these things started to really create a really unhealthy and quite a toxic picture. And then it was made worse again by the fact that the trust was deciding that it was going for foundation status. And that was the real sort of nail in the coffin, as it were, because that was the driver then. It was absolutely all about hitting that foundation status, being in charge of our own finances. So that's why the financial elements were just so important. And they were absolutely cutting down on everything. But we were told throughout all of this, as we still raised concerns, that just hang with us. They were sort of dangling the carrot of, it's going to be better because we're going to get foundation status and then it's going to be fine. We're going to have loads more nurses, loads more doctors, all the training you want. It's going to be great. It's just this period. You've just got to keep with us. And of course you do. You want to. You want to be a team player. You want to sort of, see the light at the end of the tunnel. So you think, okay, we can do this. They then started to modify and change the department, so obviously a lot of costs went into that. So that caused a lot of logistical nightmares in terms of how we ran an A&E effectively. And that in itself, as I say, caused a lot of problems. So we're continuing to raise concerns through that process as well, and really just felt that we were not being listened to. So at this point, they created a clinical decisions unit. So the other massive driving factor was had foundation status, but we also had the 4-hour A&E wait and the breach time of that. So that was the sole focus of everybody in the hospital, was getting people in and out and through A&E within that 4 hours. And of course it wasn't possible, not just because we had issues within A&E, but we didn't have the flow through the hospital, as I'm sure you can all appreciate. So for very real reasons, we were not hitting that target. But the pressure that came down from above, the wrath that befell any of us who didn't hit that target was immense and really unjust and unhelpful. So it developed a situation where those in charge of the shifts in A&E started to falsify, lie, pressurise others to amend the 4-hour time on the patient's documents so that it looked like they had left within 4 hours when indeed they hadn't. And in some instances, they hadn't even been seen in that time. They hadn't even been initially assessed. Let alone any sort of decision being made. So that in itself was a concern we were raising. So they created this clinical decisions unit. And it was just that, to await a clinical decision, be it admission or discharge, so they could go home. But there was a very, very clear and detailed operating policy that was established, and almost immediately this was not adhered to. So there were things like the patient had to have been seen and assessed initially in A&E before being moved to this unit. The patient had to be reasonable sound mind. They couldn't be left if they were vulnerable, if they had any mental health problems, if they were elderly and frail, particularly if they needed to be in a bed or a trolley that they could fall out of and that kind of thing. If they needed any cardiac monitoring or anything like that, they were not allowed to go down into this unit. Various things like that. They were only supposed to be in there a maximum of 24 hours as well, so even if they were in there awaiting a bed on a ward or so on, that they had to have been moved out within 24 hours. But as I say, this was all not adhered to on day one. We had very elderly, vulnerable patients placed in there without access to a call buzzer, without cot sides up on their beds, so they would fall out on the cold, hard floor. We would have cardiac patients in there with no monitoring whatsoever. We'd have patients in there for 5, 6, 7 days. We'd have patients in there who, because they were technically under the A&E consultant still, they wouldn't be seen by any post-take ward rounds, so they wouldn't be seen for days on end by anybody. They wouldn't necessarily have the correct medication because unless they'd brought their own in, we wouldn't have it. So lots of factors. Although they might be in there waiting for X-ray, bloods, that kind of thing, they wouldn't necessarily get any further on with that and any appropriate other investigations ordered. So again, a whole kind of gamut of reasons why this wasn't appropriate. And the other reason it wasn't appropriate was because it didn't really solve the problem in any way. The unit was basically just an old A&E theatre that they just fitted out with 4 beds in. Had no natural light, it had no appropriate toilet facilities at all. It literally had one tiny little cubicle with a basin, so no disabled toileting facilities. And again, we didn't have meals in A&E, and it was the A&E staff who were tasked to staff and observe this unit. So we had no additional support or help to do that, and we were already overrun and overstretched, so it served no real purpose. And it was down a very long corridor, quite away from the main hub of the A&E unit, particularly when this changed again when we had the refurb. So again, this caused major problems, and we'd often have patients or relatives sort of wandering down the corridors just trying to find somebody to look after their mum or their relative, or could they have a glass, or could they have a blanket, or could they have a commode. And frequently find patients who had soiled themselves in their own sheets because they were calling and nobody was there and nobody could hear them. I remember one gentleman trying to find somebody to help his mum, and he came sort of into the nurse's station and asked for some help. So I explained to him this, we would be with him as soon as we could, and he said, well, I don't understand, because we saw you yesterday, your A&E. My mum's in the clinical decision unit now. I said, yes, but it's still technically within us, it's still A&E, so and he said, but I don't understand that, and she's supposed to have been discharged from A&E because she's been here for days now, and so I had to explain to him, but he couldn't make any sense of it, and to be honest, nor could I, so I would encourage him to put in a patient complaint. But, you know, this was just not enough for me. I just thought that every day I was just going in and sort of sticking a Band-Aid on the problems and going home thinking, you know, this isn't why I came to nursing, this isn't what I wanted to do. So things got worse and worse, and the two sisters who I mentioned were particularly bullying nurses and doctors into falsifying the breach time, and if you didn't do what they wanted you to do, your life was made very, very difficult. A lot of junior doctors who were just on rotation would, particularly in the absence of any clinical medical leadership, would defer to the senior sisters' knowledge and direction and say, well, okay. And they would be intimidated and manipulated into discharging patients before they'd had the correct bloods back or before they'd even assessed them properly. And one particular occasion sticks in my mind, and I think was probably one of the turning points for me. I mean, I say probably because there were many, but this is one of the biggest. So I'm going to apologise if I get upset, because I generally do when I tell this story, and I don't know why, because it's been so long ago and I've told it so many times, but every time I relive it, it does do that, so I apologise in advance. So it was particularly busy, well, they were always busy, late shifts, and I was in resus, as I usually was. And we had a patient who'd been waiting for some time. I'd passed her several times in a long line of patients in the corridor with a paramedic waiting to come in. And eventually she was brought through and placed in a cubicle, but still in her wheelchair, and paramedic had gone. So I was rushing through into the resus, and one of the junior doctors called me and said, could you give me a hand? I've got this patient I need to see and assess, but I can't get her out of her wheelchair. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll be with you in a minute. So I went through and saw the patient I'd seen earlier, and tried to manoeuvre her out of the chair, but I was not going to do it on my own. So I said, hang on, I'll just go and find somebody to give us a hand. So I went to find somebody, and the only person I could find was one of the sisters I've mentioned. And she sort of reluctantly and came, and as soon as we went through the cubicle, she took one look at this patient, obviously recognised her, and said, oh, God, it's just you again. Then she looked at the doctor and said, oh, you don't need to worry about this one. Don't bother getting her out of a chair, you don't need to examine her. And he said, well, she's come in with abdominal pain, so I want to do an abdo assessment. And she said, no, you don't need to. She was in yesterday, and she's just a naughty little monkey. And she's just constipated, and she's not taking her laxatives. Don't bother getting her out. We need the space. Just get her discharged, get her back home. She can go back to the nursing home. So the backstory to this is that she was about 75, so not particularly old, and had been in good health really, but it's very suddenly in recent weeks sort of gone off her legs and become a little bit infirm and unwell. So she'd gone into a local nursing home just for respite only. And she didn't have any relatives or friends nearby, I think, so she was quite vulnerable. And she had started to feel that she'd got abdominal pain and so on, so she'd come in the day before and had been diagnosed with constipation, basically, and given the relative laxatives. And then at this point, so the sister's sort of speaking to the doctor, and the patient can obviously hear, and I noticed that she's crying, so I bent down next to her. Sorry, I told you I would. And just, tried to just reassure her, and she was so apologetic. I'm sorry to be a nuisance, Duck, I'm so sorry. And she said, I haven't been taking them because I can't get out my chair at the home to get to the toilet, and I'm so worried about soiling myself. That's why I haven't taken them. But I know I'm naughty and I should have done. So I said, don't worry, we'll sort you out. So the sister had gone by this point, and the doctor had given his instructions. But I said, look, come on, let's try again, we can get her up. So as we're trying to then get her up and get her out onto the trolley, we get a standby call, and I'm called back up into resus. So I said, look, I'll be back, or I'll try and get somebody else to come to you. So I go off, I've managed to find a healthcare support worker and said, please, can you go and help? Which apparently they did try to, but they were called off as well. So I go into resus, and I'm there for some time. And I come out and sort of want to know, I go, and she's not in the cubicle she was, so I know she's disappeared somewhere. And eventually I find her in the sort of makeshift waiting room, just sitting on her own with a wheelchair. And she started vomiting into a bowl. And I go and find the doctor again to say, what's happening with that lady? Did you examine her? And he said, well, no, because I was never able to get her out the chair, and the sister moved her out into the waiting room, and they've booked an ambulance to take her back, so I've just discharged her. So I said, well, she's now vomiting, so I think you need to reassess her. And he said, well, I can't because she'll be coming up to a breach now. I said, well, forget a breach, we'll book her in again if necessary. But again, I get called off into resus, so I can't do much more at that point. Except I did go and speak to the sister and reiterate my concerns about it, but again, I was in resus, so I couldn't do much more. So the next morning, I'm on an early shift again, and we get a standby call, I'm in resus again, and the paramedics arrive, and this patient's now on a trolley and coming back in to resus, and she's sort of in and out of consciousness, but she recognises me at this point. Again, I'm getting upset. And I took my hand, I took her hand, and she said, am I going to die? And I said, obviously the best thing, all you can say at that point, just try to give her enough reassurance I could at that point. And ultimately she did die. So my upset about all of that really was the fact, not necessarily that she died, because a post-mortem and further investigation proved that even if she had been admitted, it wouldn't necessarily have made a difference. I mean, I thought she'd got some sort of perforation or something like that, which she didn't. But that wasn't really my argument necessarily. My argument was how badly she was treated in her last 24 hours of life. And it was compounded and made worse by the fact that when I'd found her sitting in a wheelchair vomiting into a bowl, it was about 6 o'clock in the evening. I later found out that she waited till 1 o'clock that morning, the next morning, before a non-emergency ambulance was available to take her back to her home. And she was left all on her own in a chair for all that amount of time, only to go back to a nursing home, to come back in again in a much worse state and to die in those circumstances. So that for me was a crunch point of, look, we just can't do this anymore. This attitude, this behaviour towards our patients as if they're a nuisance is just not right. So I started to escalate more and more concerns, and particularly around the behaviour of the two nurses I've mentioned. And that's just one example, there are many. So there was some action taken initially, and we ended up with an investigation, and we ended up with 2 nurses being suspended. But the investigation was flawed from the outset. The investigating officer tasked to look into it initially was well known to be very good friends with the 2 nurses in the hospital, so that didn't really help or fill us with any confidence. We then did have an independent investigator who came in. I went to my meeting for about 3 hours, came back. They eventually sent me through the sort of transcript with HR from that meeting, and there was some inaccuracies, so I sent it back saying, if you can just amend these bits, I'd be happy to sign. I never saw it again. The sisters were suspended for probably about 6 months, if not more, in total, and we still didn't have a conclusion to anything. And the staff were understandably quite concerned, but by this point we had had a ward manager appointed, a permanent ward manager appointed. So on one particular day, we were all taking it in turn to do our our off duties, and it was my time to do it. So I'd gone into the staff room to take down the list of people's requests for off duty, and our ward manager, who'd I think only been in post about 2 weeks at that point, to be fair, but came up to me and said, "Oh, by the way, Helene, before you take that down, you need to factor these two back in," and pointed to the two sisters' names. And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, they're coming back next month, so you need to put them back in." And I said, "Well, what? What do you mean they're coming back? We haven't had a conclusion to the investigation or anything." So she said, "Well, I don't know, that's all I've been told, you just need to do that." So I was very bemused and confused and went out onto the shop floor. And one of the matrons, who had been very supportive through the process of raising our concerns, came to find me, and she looked quite ashen, and she said she'd just come from a meeting and just heard herself that they were both coming back. And she herself had raised the fact that there'd been no conclusion to the investigation and what support was there going to be for the staff who had spoken up and so on. And she was told in no uncertain terms by the Chief Operating Officer to sit down and shut up, that the decision had been made and everybody had to get on with it, and that was that. So the matron's advice to me was, "You need to get out." She said, "I'm going to leave and you need to do the same." So I was like, okay, that's great. So around this point as well, I should mention that when we'd sort of had the investigation start and we'd been going to interviews and so on, I did think, well, I probably ought to get a bit of advice from my union, because, again, at no point when I was sort of officially putting in reports and so on did I think I was blowing the whistle or anything like that. I just thought I was just doing what you're supposed to do when things are not right as a registered nurse, but just as a human being, to speak up and say this isn't right. So when it all escalated like it did, it shocked me a little bit, and I thought, oh, well, I probably ought to sort of get some advice. So I went to speak to a regional union rep. I purposely didn't speak to the local reps within the hospital because, again, it's a relatively small hospital and everybody knew each other. I knew that some of the union reps, they were great, but I knew they were very friendly with the two of the sisters and so on, so I thought that's not necessarily going to be helpful. So I went to speak to the union regional rep, so I thought that would sort of give a degree of sort of outside influence. And initially, he was quite supportive. I told him what I'd done. I told him that there was going to be some investigations and we'd go through that process. And he said, okay, well, just keep me posted on how things go. So when myself and others started to have threats and intimidation made as well, to the fact that we'd spoken up throughout the whole process, a lot of us were threatened. As you can appreciate, it caused a lot of divide in the hospital and in the department, because a lot of people supported these two sisters because they were afraid of them. And a lot of people thought, well, nothing's going to change, so actually we don't want to go against them, we don't want to be seen to side against them. So it did create that divide, and obviously they did have their friends and genuine supporters as well, so it created a lot of animosity in the department, and that bubbled over into threats being made about our physical safety. So I was warned about walking to my car at night after a late shift, watch your back when you walk across the car park because somebody's out to get you, people threatening that they knew where I lived, really ridiculous but awful things. So it resulted in me having to have my dad or my husband come and meet me out of work. But then later as well, when the sisters were returning, there started to be threats around the fact that they were going to make it look as if I'd made a drug error. So friends were sort of trying to helpfully warn me, don't check drugs with so-and-so and so-and-so. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, in a busy A&E department, when you need to track controlled drugs quickly, you don't always have that luxury. So it was incredibly intimidating going into shift every day. So I did go back to the union rep at the point where we'd been told that they were going to return, and say to him, what on earth's going on, because we haven't had any conclusion. And his tone was very different, very, very different. And he said, oh, yeah, and he obviously already knew. Oh, yeah, don't worry about it, it's all been dealt with. You just don't need to know the detail, but it's all been dealt with. And I said, well, that's okay, but shouldn't we have a conclusion? I've not even had my transcript back from my meeting with HR and the investigating officer yet, or anything like that, and none of my colleagues have either. No, don't worry. They're coming back. They've had a slap on the wrist, so they're not going to do it again. And don't worry about the threats or anything like that. There's going to be some team-building exercises, so it's all going to be fine. So I thought, well, I really don't think that's going to cut it, and they never happened anyway. So I just started to feel really, again, bemused and confused about the whole situation and the whole process. So it did get to the point for me where I did have to leave. I just thought, I can't do this. I can't keep going into work every day and being afraid for my own physical and professional safety. But also, I just can't see patients suffering and my colleagues suffering in the way that they were. So I did leave and I went to work for another trust and actually had a promotion, which was fortunate for me. But kept an eye on what was going on because it was still my local hospital. I still cared very much about what was happening and also kept in touch with colleagues so I knew what the situation was, and it was no better, if not worse. So some time passed, and at the point of me leaving, we had the Healthcare Commission coming in, as was, now the CQC. And they came in about 2 weeks after the two sisters were reinstated. Make of that what you will. And we were told that we weren't allowed to speak to them, but I did try. I spoke to an inspector as she came around A&E, and I gave her my name and said, look, I work here, and so on. But she never came back to me, and so I moved on. But so sometime after I'd left, that report came out, and it was the first time anything was identified at Midstaffs as being a problem. It was clearly not exhaustive, but it was enough for the first time to have identified that there were some key areas of significant concern, and it was enough to hit the press and the media. So I was driving home after a late shift, and the then Health Secretary, Alan Johnson, was on the radio, and he was being questioned about this, report that's just come out today. And he said, well, yes, it's very concerning, and we need to look into it more, and it's very, very worrying. But what concerned him more was the fact that no nurses or doctors were speaking up about the concerns in the hospital. So as you can imagine, there were a few expletives at the radio as I drove home. I was just incensed, and I had a day off the next day, so I managed somehow to get hold of Dr. Heather Wood, who led that investigation for the Healthcare Commission, told her everything, and she was really shocked because she knew nothing about it, and the fact that two sisters had just been reinstated literally 2 weeks before they came in. And she said we'd asked them for any significant investigations or suspensions or anything, and we saw a couple of token things, but very low level. She said nothing of this passed over us. So she said, if they've kept this from us, what else have they kept from us? So she said, she said, obviously my investigation's concluded, but I suspect there's going to need to be more. So have you got evidence of this? And of course, kept copies of everything. So I sent her everything I'd got. And at the same time, I started speaking to local MPs because I thought I just need to do more. And their response was really good. But at that point, I did it under a sort of false name as well because I was afraid. I was still working in the NHS, and I was still really afraid. So we all now know, obviously, what happened. And I gave evidence at the initial independent inquiry, forensic inquiry, and then at the public inquiry. And of course, by that point, people knew who I was. They obviously had to. And then following on from that, also at an NMC fitness to practice hearing in which the two nurses were actually struck off the register, which was really sad. And it shouldn't have had to come to that. But the evidence was so overwhelming against them. But at the same time, they refused even several years later to acknowledge that they'd done anything. And that was the NMC's call. If they'd acknowledged and shown some insight into their behaviour to identify that they had learnt from it and changed, they wouldn't have necessarily been struck off. But it was the fact that they just, blatantly refused to accept anything that's what happened. But the other shocking factor for me was when I'd gone to the independent inquiry, I gave them all my evidence and more, obviously, as I'm giving it to you. So by the time I went back to the public inquiry, the QC who was questioning me said that they'd, in the interim, done some further investigation and found out some more. And would it surprise me to learn that they'd been told by somebody relatively senior in HR that a deal had been struck between the RCN rep and the chief exec. And the RCN rep had actually been representing the two nursing sisters at the same time as supposedly representing and supporting me. And he hadn't declared that conflict of interest. And then he had also made a deal with the chief exec to reinstate the two nurses without any further sanctions or anything against them before the Healthcare Commission came in. Otherwise, they would come back at the trust with a counter-complaint that the sisters themselves were being bullied. And that's the deal that was struck. So I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I get it now. But was really horrified that those mechanisms and supports out there for us had let us down so dramatically in that whole situation and process. And that's really what then propelled me to do more, because I came away thinking, do you know what, mid-staffs isn't a one-off. It was a perfect storm, and there was a whole combination of things all there all at once that made it as bad as it was. But we know it wasn't a one-off, and we know that there are elements of that going on up and down the country in different wards, different units, different pockets of the NHS now. Therefore, there will be other nurses, doctors, healthcare, social care workers who are feeling like I did and feeling really vulnerable and thinking, well, I need to say something, but how do I? Or once I have said something and I'm hit with that brick wall, where do I go to next? What do I do? So that is really what then propelled me and led me to create the Ambassador for Cultural Change role at my existing trust. And the impact of that was huge. We developed it so that it would help change cultures around staff speaking up, but actually not just around speaking up, because it's a step before that. It's actually, if you get the culture right in the first place, staff will just be able to speak up. And it's about the link directly from the front line straight up to the executive and the executive level and board level, and that's who I report directly into. And the success of this role very, very quickly proved so much that we thought, well, we need to share this, and we did start to share it. In fact, Birmingham Children's Hospitals just here was one of the first to adopt the role in its entirety, and many, many others as well. And I started mentoring other people in the role, going up and down the country, helping other trusts establish the role and sit on interview panels and such. But then we thought, well, we need to do more, and there was lots of lobbying from lots of people up and down the country on the wider issues around whistleblowing in the NHS. So we had the Robert Francis Freedom Speak Up review in 2015, and I was asked by the Secretary of State to assist Robert Francis on that review, which I happily did. And he came up with several recommendations, but two of which were that every trust in the country would have a Freedom to Speak Up guardian based on the model of my role. And the second would be that we would have a national Freedom to Speak Up guardian to sort of oversee these roles and to create guidance and support and create a network to go across the country. So the national office was established in October 2016, so just 2 years ago. And there's been huge pace and projecting forward in that 2 years. It's been massive. We've still got a long way to go, but we now do have a guardian in every organisation. They vary slightly, and it worries me a little bit that there's not greater standardisation, because we need greater consistency. But it's there and it's growing. We now have Freedom to Speak Up included in the CQC inspections under the well-led domain as well, which is really important to make sure that the inspectors come in and will want to speak to your Freedom to Speak Up guardian, and should have that sort of access and transparency to do so. But for me, it's about sort of breaking down those barriers. So we know that the barriers still exist. We know that there's still massive problems with HR. And I'm not putting it all at HR's door, because they have a very difficult role to play. And they do a really good job. But so much of my own experience and so much of what I hear now up and down the country is based around failures in HR. We need to get better at that. And we need to break down some of the hierarchy within organisations, and the fact that staff don't feel able to speak up. They don't feel it's their place to. They don't feel that they're given permission to. Well, they absolutely are, and they must do. And even if they're wrong, even if as long as it's genuine, even if they're wrong, it's far better for somebody to speak up about something and have action taken and have it investigated, and then it proved to have not been quite accurate. But that's fine, as long as it's established and as long as action is taken if it needs to be. We know as well that there are issues with the unions. Obviously, my own experience led into that. I now actually have to work with that rep, though, in my role now. He profusely apologised to me 5 years ago when I started creating the role, and my then chief executive helped sort of facilitate a meeting, because obviously he understood the background. So he arranged for us to meet, and the union rep came in and literally bowed to me and took my hand and apologised profusely, and said that he'd very much changed his practice and the way he thinks his role works since then. But he did apologise, and he said, I threw you to the wolves. So he acknowledged it, and he apologised, and I'm a big girl, and I took it, and we worked closely together. In fact, I've been on the phone to him on the train on the way here, because we're dealing with a case together. So, it is important that we learn. It's not about hauling people out and shooting them at dawn. It's about saying, look, we're all human. We will get things wrong. We are here to try and make things better for patients. Nothing in the NHS is going to be perfect, and it's always going to be changing. But we have to encourage the staff to speak up. We have to look after our workforce. We have to enable them to speak up freely, and we have to act when they do. Otherwise, patients and staff suffer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helene, for, again, a really, really heartfelt kind of, raw experience that you highlighted about when it goes wrong, how badly it goes wrong, and how quickly things can deteriorate, and the personal consequences that has for individuals, and importantly for kind of patients and service users. So I'm really, really grateful for Helene's time today, but we do have some time for some questions directly to Helene, and then we've got a slight panel. So has anybody got a specific question for Helene you want to discuss?
Hi there, thanks. Hi. Firstly, thank you. You're incredibly brave, and the bravery should be commended in speaking out about these sorts of issues. I was really caught by your comments about the current failings still within HR and the journey that needs to be done there. And I'm one of the few HR people in the room, so that really got my attention as well. What do you think the single biggest failings are, and do you think HR departments within NHS trusts know that these are current failings and the work that we've got to do around this?
Not necessarily. I think obviously every trust should have a Freedom Speak Up Guardian, and it's my drive that all Freedom Speak Up Guardians have a very close link to HR. I don't think they should sit within HR, again, to sort of keep that distance. But it's really important that you link in, you triangulate information, soft intelligence, because again, the important thing about the role really is that it's supposed to be preventative. We don't want it to wait until there's problems. We want it to be that kind of early intervention to try and put things right. And by working with HR, hopefully, and OD as well, massively, hopefully you can achieve that. So I would hope that they are aware, because they should be speaking to their Freedom Speak Up Guardian and all the other routes and methods that are out there, obviously. But I think some of it is just because they're just trying to get on with the day job. They're so busy, they're so pressured, as we all are. They've kind of got blinkers on, and they're just thinking of it in that kind of narrow tunnel vision almost. And sometimes we need to kind of put a heads up, stop and go, hang on a minute, let's just look at the bigger picture. So much of HR is obviously kind of process-driven, policy-driven, and they're there for good reason, but they get in the way. They get in the way of the human element of it. And sometimes we just have to sort of heads up and go, actually, how would I feel if this was me? What would be a common sense kind of just reaction to it? And let's try and take it away from going down those very strict grievance kind of processes, because ultimately nobody wins, and let's try and get in there early before it gets to that point. But if it is going down that point, make sure that it's fair, make sure that it's as open and transparent as it can be. And I know that there are barriers to that for good reason, but so often there isn't a good reason, and it's just, well, you can't know that, we can't, and that just creates paranoia and builds up that sort of insecurity, and it just prevents people from speaking up in the first place. But there's lots of things I think HR workers can do to help break down some of those barriers. So I know HR are there to assist and advise the trust and the managers, but that then sets up a kind of us and them. So if you go and speak to your average member of staff, they don't trust HR, and they say, well, they're just there for the trust, they're just there for the trust. And they're not there for the trust, really. They're there to make sure there's fair process. And so for me, it's even about the position that HR people situate themselves. So literally when somebody is called to a meeting, firstly, you'd hope that they're prepared to have an HR person there. The amount of times I'm told by staff, but I just thought I was going to supervision with a manager, and I get there and there's somebody from HR, and suddenly I'm being performance managed or something like that. And although, if they do go to a meeting, they sort of walk into the room and there's the manager and the HR person and the desk, and then the person sort of sitting over here on their own, and it's quite intimidating. So it's even as simple as an HR person sitting sort of in the middle and physically representing that sort of balance. And I know it's silly, but it makes a big difference. So it's just little things like that, but it does go a long way.
Thank you. Lady.
Sorry, I'd just like to reply to that as a HR person as well. And I haven't grown up in the HR world, but I have grown up in the NHS. So I found myself here by default. And I kind of agree, really, that there's something about putting the heart into HR, and you may be there to serve the trust, but actually the trust is there to serve its patients.
Absolutely.
And that's absolutely what we should be doing. So, and looking at some of the encouraging work going on in other organisations like Merseycare around just culture and safety culture. We had a discussion with our team about revising policies around safety culture, and one of the HR business partners said, "Well, I've only ever been taught to write policies in a certain way, but it doesn't mean that they can't learn to do it differently and to make it work better." So
Absolutely.
I think it is work in process. I find it sad when people criticise HR because they are doing a big, a good job, but we need to get better at understanding how we best support the organisation, because by supporting the staff, you have to see, and that's the work I'm trying to do at the minute.
Yeah.
So thank you.
No, thank you, and I absolutely agree. It is about changing hearts and minds, and it isn't about laying it at any one area's door, because it isn't. We've all got to work together, and there are some fantastic HR workers out there. So my very best friend is an HR, not in the NHS, but she is. So I know the good work they do as well.